All right, everybody. I see that I've been pinned. It's just about time to start at 3:30. Just waiting for people to get settled in here as they're joining us. And I'll say greeting to you all. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for a conversation focused on energy-related greenhouse gas emissions post-COVID-19. We are delighted to work with Rebecca Titler, who invited us to collaborate with the Loyola Sustainability Research Centre and Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability to bring you this sustainability and the pandemic series. And this is, in fact, the last in this particular series for this year. And thankfully, the year is almost over. So I'll let Rebecca tell you about what's happening in 2021, probably at the end of today's session. Just a few words about Concordia University's Force Space. We are physically located in downtown Tiohtià:ke or Montreal on unceded Indigenous lands. We welcome our community of researchers, faculty members, and students into the space so that we might collaborate on ways to make your research and initiatives and course activities publicly accessible. So in light of this, we're very happy to host today's conversations and presentations. I'll just mention for the audience who is joining us, please make our lives a little bit easier by posting your questions directly into the Q&A, which Rebecca will be keeping an eye on and bringing those questions to the panelists who have joined us. But if you have any comments throughout the session, just kind of supportive comments or reflections, feel free to use the chat for those. That's open to you as well. So on that note, I'm passing it over to Jim Grant to get us going. Hi, Jim.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to Fourth Space for hosting this event for us. I am the principal of Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability and a co-director of the Loyola Sustainability Research Centre, so it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers today. I'll introduce our first speaker first, who is Dr. Simon Langlois-Bertrand. Simon is a professor in the Department of Political Science here at Concordia University, and his research focuses on the geopolitics of the ecological transition and the circular economy. So, Simon, take it away.
All right, let me just share this and I'll get started. So I'm really happy to be here, obviously, in this series and in this particular webinar. And I'll be having a short discussion over these potential transformative impacts, as I call them, to energy-related GHG profiles as a result or potential result, again, of the COVID health crisis. So thanks for the LSRC and for Space for organizing this, of course. This is research that is partly financed by the Trottier Energy Institute. So this is part of the Canadian Energy Outlook 2020, which is actually going to be 2021 at this point, but which is basically a modeling exercise that we do every 2 years that studies different scenarios for reaching net zero emissions in 2050. And this time around, this is one of the reasons for the delay. We're doing the more difficult exercise of maintaining the net zero target until 2060, which has not been done that much. So anyways, more on this in a few weeks and months. So I focus on energy-related activities because about 75 to 80% of world greenhouse gas emissions come from energy production, transport, and user consumption, and so on. And in Canada, this is actually a higher figure, about 83%, give or take. It's higher than elsewhere in the world because of the gas and oil industry, of course, partly, but also importantly, because of the highest consumption per capita profile in the OECD, save for Iceland, much tinier country, of course, in terms of the size of the economy and the population. But all that to say that this is why so much attention is given to energy-related activities, and that's been the attention of policy in the past as well, past years and decades. From encouraging renewables deployment in electricity production to zero emission vehicle mandates and so on, right? So the question I wanted to discuss today is actually twofold. So first is, with current knowledge, what is likely to be the medium term to long term impacts of the COVID period on energy related emissions? Meaning, what ongoing trends can we extrapolate as potentially transformative changes to energy systems as opposed to shorter term changes? And the second aspect is, how should policy design treat uncertainty in this regard? to ensure that the crisis is either used as an opportunity to accelerate the emission mitigation effort, or at the very least limit the damage of some of the trends that we've been observing. And I'll highlight 5 of these actually as a starting point for this discussion. I don't pretend that this is the full list, not, far from it, and it's really not necessarily the 5 most outstanding ones, but there are definitely 5 core ones that are particularly relevant to this discussion. One is the increase in work from home that's been discussed so much over the past few months. I would point out as kind of a side note here that although I'll take that as a starting point and one of the main drivers in my discussion, the latest survey by Statistics Canada counted 2.5 million workers who are working from home in the current context when they weren't prior to the pandemic. So this is less than 10% of the Canadian workforce, and therefore we have to put that in perspective to a certain extent, because in some of the discussions we may talk about this change a bit disproportionately, but I'll try to factor that into the discussion later on. It's definitely a sizable number, obviously. I don't want to suggest otherwise, but just something to point out. What else? A drastic fall in demand for passenger flights, a reduction to medium to large, and I would say these days, small meetings, gatherings, activities, an increase in online shopping and the use of delivery services all around, and an increase in demand for residences outside of urban centers, on top of the already observed urban sprawl tendency in many urban centers across North America in particular. I'll focus on Canada, of course, but so also something observed that people reevaluating their preferences, both because of some of the other trends in this list, but also because of other reasons as well. So I want to discuss mostly 2 sectors. One is the transport sector, and I'll do away with the discussion of air transport, which is of course very interesting, but just to keep the scope manageable here. The transport sector has been notoriously difficult to decarbonize, as you may well know, mostly because not just of technological constraints, but also because of the fact that demand just keeps growing and has been for quite some time. It's been slowing down over the past decade compared to the 2 decades before, but slowing down is not like going down by any means, and therefore it's certainly a sector that attracts a lot of attention because of these difficulties. And I'll distinguish between personal transport and commercial transport. So the idea here is to think about the potential drivers and which direction they point us to in terms of, on what does energy demand and consumption profiles depend in the transport sector, and how does that relate to the trend highlighted on the previous slide, and a reflection over the potential locking in of some of these trends. So certainly the work from home has been generating a lot of discussion. This is an arrow that is pointing down, all else being equal, or on average, whatever you want to use to say this, with many people working from home, of course, and not driving to work. So on the aggregate, this is a downward trend, and a pretty important one, although very early on in the year, some numbers started coming out to point out that this was not as sizable, perhaps, as many people thought, right? So highlighting again that the transport sector is difficult to decarbonize, not just because of technological constraints and preferences, but also because there's a lot going on, and driving to work is an important aspect, but not 80% of these emissions. But definitely an arrow in the downward direction on this little chart here with GHG emissions on the vertical axis. So some counter pressures perhaps to that decrease. One, of course, is that work from home is unlikely to remain as important over the longer term. And again, I don't have a crystal ball here, and that's not the goal, but the discussions by large office employers so far are focused on whether or not we will see a return to normal office work hours. And definitely the discussion seems to be that at least for many in this particular section of the workforce, there will be more flexibility in terms of the schedules offered by employers in the future, meaning something like a part-time work from home and work in person kind of trend that we may observe in the future. So in other words, the downward arrow may shrink, but it's likely to remain pointing down although there are other counter pressures, of course. One is the increased demand for residences outside of urban centers, I pointed out, and therefore, if more people are making a different choice in terms of their preferences for the location of their residence and move outside of the city, again, on average, and all else being equal, that results in more demand for transport, normally associated with more energy consumption. And in the transport sector, that's automatically resulting in greenhouse gas emission increase. Another countering pressure is a decreased demand for public transit in high density zones. So there's going to be a lot of stuff written on the potential cultural shift for at least some people in terms of their preferences for public transit. So people that may be reluctant after this period to go back into a crowded subway or bus service, for instance. So again, that's not going to be 90% of the population, but this will be a few percentage points, and this arrow is likely to be, upward in that particular discussion. Now, if we take this and move into the discussion about the commercial sector, there's been a lot of talk about this, what is basically a shift from personal transport demand to commercial transport demand. Translation being that people stay at home, but they tend to shop online more because they get out of the house more. So it's a decrease in personal transport demand, but it's an increase in commercial transport demand. And the problem with regard to greenhouse gas emissions is that residential commercial transport emissions are the most, or residential commercial transport, I should say, so deliveries to residences is the most GHG intensive subsector of that particular side of the puzzle, right? So meaning that to get the truck to your home every 2 days to deliver a package offsets a lot of the reduction in emissions that result from you staying at home and not driving your car. So again, counter pressure, of course, with a lot of uncertainty to the extent, but certainly the numbers that we've seen over the past few months, in some cases doubling or tripling in the amount of small packages delivered to residences gives us a fairly good idea that this is a pretty important counter pressure. There's other stuff to discuss here, and of course I'll keep the scope manageable, but does that result in additional pressure on infrastructure? So more people moving outside of urban centers, so more demand for road infrastructure, more maintenance, all construction activities normally GHG intensive, so that could be a counter pressure or counter driver as well. And there's of course the impact on the material use for the additional demand for small package delivery. So the so-called last mile deliveries mean small packages, so more cardboard, more plastic, which implies additional energy use, both because of the additional space plus weight pressure on commercial fuel consumption and as a result the emissions, but also in terms of the embedded emissions in because of the life cycle of the packaging. So that's for the transport sector. In terms of the building sector, perhaps a bit more rapidly, normally distinguish residential buildings from commercial buildings in this discussion or in the discussion over the building sector. So can we have the same discussion, on what does energy demand and consumption profiles depend in the building sector? So the work from home definitely results in more emissions, and especially in the winter that's coming, we'll see that space heating, which is the main point of consumption for energy in residential buildings, is likely to go up again on average. So many people don't care about their consumption and don't do anything to their heating preferences when they leave for work, or when they used to leave for work. But many people do, and therefore if they're staying at home, they won't be doing that. They'll keep the heating going, and that results in more energy consumption on average across the country, again, and it depends on the region, resulting in more emissions as well. But there's more to this that I think is much more interesting here, which is in relation to the increased demand for residences outside of urban centers. Again, one of the big question mark, how many people are part of that trend on the longer term. And this shift is actually associated with a shift in building demand profiles, right? So if you increase work from home and demand for space, it leads to more space per person or per household, sorry. and as a result, more demand for different building types, namely, many people moving from an apartment in the city center to a single detached or attached home. So both these developments lead to more energy consumption, so more space heating demand, more consumption, more emissions. And this is worsened by the fact that across the country, on average, natural gas is more likely to be the source of heating for detached or single homes, detached or attached, compared to apartments where electricity prevails. So that means that two pressures are pointing in the same direction, and that is upward on the emission arrow that you see here. So I'll say just a quick word about the commercial sector. So similar reflection certainly about the trend to have more space per worker already in place, obviously, but reversing the trend over the past 15 years to increase the amount of workers per square meter. So now there's very likely to be, at least on the medium term, a trend in the other direction, at least due to sanitation measures, but also because of changing preferences. On the plus side, though, or the minus side, I guess, on the GHG emission scale, that should result in a stronger drive for energy efficiency in that space. So not just from a cost / technological perspective, but also in terms of reimagining and optimizing the use of space. So office sharing, room sharing, location sharing among different employers and so on. So I see that I'm happy to be at the last slide at this point, but I said I would say a few words about recommendations, or at least policy thoughts. So policies are supposed to manage uncertainties in light of the possibilities that are outlined above. So again, this is not a crystal ball. Even a modeling exercise could not factor any satisfactory degree of certainty here, but the policies are supposed to take that into account and retain a good amount of flexibility, but at the same time be rapid in cementing the desired orientations for certain aspects, right? So as such, there's a pretty large amount of effort already underway to plan how to move this forward, and again, use the crisis as an opportunity to make sure that the desired orientations are indeed cemented. So in terms of the two sectors I looked at in transport, certainly governments can look into increasing the offer for medium distance public transit, but also putting the emphasis on attention to health guidelines. So perhaps getting back some of these people I was highlighting earlier, that may be much more reluctant to use the public transit because of health concerns. So there's a reputational impact of the crisis on public transit that's going to need some repair, and action on this is certainly warranted earlier rather than later. The second point is always the same thing about the transport sector: do whatever is necessary to keep demand down. So this is the difficulty here. So perhaps more support for work from home transitions to capitalize on that. There's a lot of discussion here, and I don't have time to do justice to all the ideas that come out here, but certainly something to keep in mind as well. And reward the innovative solutions in commercial transport. Purelator, for instance, a few weeks ago announced deployment of a fleet of small zero-emission vehicles for the last mile delivery. So certainly something to encourage. So if I can, just a few seconds on the buildings. The attention to energy efficiency and renovation projects, as so many people are reimagining, ways to upgrade their homes at this point. So that means a higher demand for renovations, and perhaps something to do with the barriers that have been pretty well identified in literature on this. And the putting in place of roundtables. So large office employers have already been doing this, rethinking of office space use, but governments could play a role in terms of a hub to share the best practices here to smaller actors who may not have the resources to make that same reflection. So I'll stop here, a little bit over, but hopefully good enough.
Thank you so much, Simo. I learned. Does anybody have any questions? We can take questions from the panel as well. We're looking for more points of clarification at this point, and then if you have more in-depth questions a little bit later on, we can ask those once Shadnoush Pashaei has also given her presentation. So we'll just take a couple of quick questions right now. I see that one participant has a hand raised. Just let me get there. Okay. Where are you? Okay. Emma, I've unmuted your mic so you can ask your question.
This was more an in-depth question than a short clarification question.
Okay, do you want to save it until the end?
I can do.
Okay, does anybody have a question for clarification? Yes, overall, how much reduction can we hope to see from this, or net zero?
How much reduction from the current the current period over the longer term? I think things are not looking that good at this point, actually. And to a certain extent, that's what I try to point toward in this discussion. Not necessarily to be pessimistic, and there's certainly some sort of encouraging reactions to what to do with the current context and these trends, but there is a lot of work to be done to make sure that the direction stays the same. And perhaps what I wanted to highlight as well here is that the earlier discussions over the summer, perhaps, on these issues were much too optimistic in my mind in terms of reduction in emissions that would naturally result from people staying at home more. Well, not quite, right? There's quite a few counter pressures, and I would point out that there's quite a few I didn't have time to cover here as well. And so hopefully there's proper attention given to this, because this is still an opportunity in my mind if there's enough attention given by policy actors in particular.
Okay, does anybody else have a question that's more point of clarification? No, Emma, do you want to ask your question now, or you want to wait? Right. Okay. I have a point of clarification question, which is what you mean by medium distance public transit. Can you give an example in Montreal? What would you mean by that?
No. So I was talking about either the how can I say this? The more distant boroughs and cities on the island of Montreal, or the short distance suburbs, as they're often called. So as opposed to the broader greater metropolitan area. But everything on the early part of the North Shore and South Shore, Laval, and of course the eastern part of the island, in particular in the western part. So whatever is necessary to integrate that much better in the public transit system. So there's been quite a bit of movement over the past 2 years here, and perhaps there's even more effort that can be done in this context, but that's the idea.
All right. I have one more question, and then we'll move on to the next speaker, which is, could the last mile deliveries be done by bike? Considering the new bike paths along Saint-Denis and Montreal, maybe this could help. I know some people are doing this.
Yeah, they're actually they're already being done. So it's obviously the winter is going to have a tempering effect on that a little bit. But like I said, Purolator and a few of the other bigger delivery companies are putting a lot of thought into that. Not just because of their desire to have a better sustainability profile, but also because it's more fuel and therefore more cost, and it's become much more difficult for them to offer the rates that they've been offering to customers. So that's a trend that's been highlighted in surveys so far this year, that people are much more willing to shop online, but they're also not more willing to pay for shipping. And therefore, there's a whole discussion about what the role of shipping costs are actually can actually be done with at this point here. And so we'll see if how that results into different services. But yes, delivery companies are definitely looking at those vehicles.
Right, great. Okay, one more question. Do decreases generally outweigh increases, or is the finding that contrary to main media, emissions are increasing and not decreasing?
On the aggregate, I'm assuming is the question. I don't know, which I guess is the title of my presentation to a certain extent. So potential transformative impacts. The whole point here is that there's a lot of uncertainty. So what do you do when there's so much uncertainty? Can you or can you just do nothing because you don't know? Or is there a way to put an orientation with a lot of flexibility to make sure that you don't cover all the possibilities, but you cover the ones that seem to be more likely? And so this is really the idea. So all the charts I had with the little arrows, I want to highlight, perhaps I should have put that on these slides. The size of the arrow is not proportional to any estimation, right? So the idea is that we don't know what the size of each arrow is. And of course, having an idea of the net impact is impossible because of this. So what do you do to ensure that the arrows pointing down are the most important ones in the end? Well, there's a role for policy in that, I think, pretty important.
All right. Thank you. I think that's a great lead in to Shadnoush's to our next presentation, actually. So I'll let Jim introduce our next speaker. And if you do have questions, please just keep them for the end after Shadnoush's talk, where we'll take first points of clarification about her talk and then more general questions. I think Emma Desplan is first in line at the end of the second talk. All right, go.
Great. Thank you, Simone, and thanks, Rebecca. So our next speaker is Shadnoush Pashaei, who is a recent graduate of Concordia University, where she received a master's in environmental engineering. Her research focuses on energy efficiency modeling and the assessment of greenhouse gas emissions. So really relevant and interesting talk to parallel that of Simone. Shadnoush, take it away, please.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad for being here, and let's share my screen to start the presentation. Yeah, I think now you would see my, yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about the assessment of greenhouse gas emissions. So let's say I developed a model for the analysis of urban greenhouse gas emissions, and I also assessed the greenhouse gas emissions of Montreal Island as a case study, and the sensitivity of model parameters is done to figure out which contributing factors have the most impact on total greenhouse gas emission, that they really help to know the impacts of COVID-19 on greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to start to show you the contributing factors on urban greenhouse gas emissions. We do have some like transportation, heating, waste, and electricity. One of the goals of my work, it was to get the more accurate results, because the assessment of greenhouse gas emissions is the first step of mitigation planning. That's why for some categories like transportation, I divided into 3 sectors, like public transportation, including buses and subways, and also suburban public transportation includes any types of vehicle that they connect city to the suburb, and also private vehicles. Waste also is divided into solid waste and wastewater. So for going through the results and discussion, first I'm going to show you the boundary which has been considered for my study, which is Montreal Island, and all of this assessment is done for a single year, which is 2016, and then I will study the impacts of COVID-19 on greenhouse gas emissions. The most challenging part of assessment of greenhouse gas emissions is the activity data. And here you can see the list of organizations that they help me to provide information and activity data on me for assessment of greenhouse gas emissions. And I had a small collaboration with the city of Montreal, and you can see the picture of my presentation. So for urban public transportation, this table shows the sort of fuels that they are consumed in urban public transportation. We do have diesel, gasoline, natural gas, hydropower, and biodiesel. To make faster and easier the assessment for other estimator, I provided emission factors for any sectors in my research, because I tried to provide these emission factors based on different source of fuels, units, and locations that can do the assessment easier and faster. So here you can see on your left side the energy consumption in Montreal in 2016. And on your right side, you can see the greenhouse gas emissions in Montreal in 2016 that shows diesel has the highest rate of consumption in urban public transportation with 55%, and it has also the highest rate of greenhouse gas emissions in Montreal. And then we do have biodiesel with 3%. That's the city of Montreal is trying to remove these source of fuels from urban public transportation. I also try to provide some trends of different sources of fuels in different sectors. And here we can see from urban public transportation, diesel, electricity, biodiesel, and gasoline over the period from 2006 to 2016. For suburban public transportation, let's say there are 6 lines in Montreal that they connect Montreal Island to the suburb. So EXO 6, which has the longest travel distance, is producing the highest amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And for private vehicles is categorized into three sectors, defined by the weight of vehicles. We do have light, medium, and heavy vehicles here. And this is road transportation emission factors that they are not only provided based on the source of fuels, units, and locations, but also based on the types of vehicles too. For private vehicles, here we can see the comparison of greenhouse gas emissions from light vehicles and also heavy vehicles. And because heavy vehicles in Montreal are traveling the longest distance, so that's why they are producing higher amount of greenhouse gas emissions when we compare to light vehicles. And the methodology that I have developed for this part is based on the number of vehicles registered in Montreal Island in a single year. And actually, this table is really valuable for me because it took me exactly 1 year to get it from Énergie Reno. There are a lot of reports for energy consumption in provinces, in countries, even in global, but there is a lack of data for urban areas. So that's why this table took me a while to get it from Énergie, the company who is in charge of distribution of natural gas over Quebec. So they provided me with different sectors: commercial, industrial, institutional, and residential. When we look at the natural gas consumption in Montreal, we can see industry is the most consumer of natural gas with 39%, and then we do have commercial with 25%. Actually, on your right side, you can see the greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas in Montreal over the period from 2014 to 2017, and we can see industry, although industry is increasing moderately, commercial over the period stayed stable. And but Énergie believed that they could save around 13 million cubic meter of natural gas by energy efficiency programs. And when we look at the figure on your right side, so we can see although Montreal has the lowest level of total greenhouse gas emissions, it has the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions per capita. During my work, I try to provide the total greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas emissions per capita, because it is very important for cities to know the amount of greenhouse gas emissions is produced by each person. For electricity, let's say 99% of electricity in Quebec is generated by hydropower, and only 1% is generated by thermal power, including diesel, gasoline, and such source of fuels. The emission factor for electricity generated by hydropower in operation is going to be 0. So which means for a single year, we don't have any greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generated by hydropower. But definitely for life cycle assessment, definitely we do have greenhouse gas emissions even from electricity generated by hydropower. But because my study is just only for a single year, we do have greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generated by thermal power, and this is a comparison of residential and commercial. And we can see that in residential, actually, they are producing higher amount of greenhouse gas emissions over the period from 2006 to 2016. For solid waste disposal, we can see comparison of Montreal with other cities like Regina in Ontario, Vancouver, and New York. And Montreal almost has the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions for total and also for per capita. But when we look at the trend of 2015-2018, we can see the greenhouse gas emissions from municipal solid waste disposal is decreasing significantly. That is really good achievement for the city. And for wastewater treatment, I try to compare greenhouse gas emissions from wastewater for Montreal with other Canadian cities. And we can see, unfortunately, greenhouse gas emissions for Montreal for both total and per capita is the highest one. But it's not so far, because the amount of water which is produced in Montreal has the highest level comparing to other Canadian cities. at the end, so let's say private vehicles is the largest driver of greenhouse gas emissions with 52%, and natural gas stands as the second level with 26%, although only 1% of electricity is generated by hydropower. 2% of total greenhouse gas emissions is attributed to electricity. And to have the net greenhouse gas emissions, we have to consider carbon sequestration by urban green space. Let's say around tons carbon dioxide equivalent is subtracted from the total greenhouse gas emissions in Montreal. And at the end, we do have around 13 million ton carbon dioxide equivalent in Montreal Island in 2016. But for the sensitivity analysis, because I had a lot of factors in my work, so I divided them into two different sectors: emission factors and other factors. Emission factors including emission factors from different sources of fuels, and emission factor for methane in wastewater or nitrous oxide in wastewater. And when we look at the bottom of this slide, we can see the variation of emission factor for heavy vehicles is the largest one, and that's why emission factor for heavy vehicles is the most significant emission factor, and then we do have emission factor for methane in wastewater. But during the pandemic, emission factors, they are not really affected because we are still using the same vehicles, and we are still producing the same amount of even wastewater and so on. But other factors are the factors that they are affected due to COVID-19, including total travel distance of suburban public transportation, average travel distance for light vehicles, for heavy vehicles, or amount of solid waste disposal. And here we can see the most significant factor is average travel distance for heavy vehicles, and then we can see the average travel distance for light vehicles is the second one. The other side, we can see the global road transport activity dropped by 15% comparing to 2019, which means we may have reduction for greenhouse gas emissions that is results from transportation. And also there is a report from Ontario that they showed in April 2020, they experienced the reduction of electricity demand. And it's not only about the electricity consumption, I mean energy consumption, but we have also experienced energy consumption behavior because we have no longer peak demand for morning and evening, and before the pandemic we have the peak demand for later part of the week, like Wednesday to Friday, but now it switched to the earlier part of the week. And also we have reduction in investment of clean energies, and the incentives offered by governments to encourage people to use more renewable technologies is decreased due to the financial issues because of the COVID-19. And there is an obvious example of a wind power plant in North Dakota, which is temporarily closed because of the COVID-19. And Ontario report that in April they had a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions 3 times more in comparison to the before of the pandemic. Restriction of human activities is going to be a key role of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions during the pandemic, because in the previous slide, in the sensitivity analysis that we can see, we do have the most significant factor, average travel distance for heavy vehicles and average travel distance for light vehicles, that now we are working from home, and it may affect the greenhouse gas emissions. But in the other side, we can see that increasing medical activities during the pandemic results in medical waste. And in the peak of the pandemic in Wuhan, there is a report that it said the medical waste reached out to 6 times more than the normal value. So yeah, there is a Probably, yeah, we do have some reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but as Simon mentioned, there are a lot of uncertainty about the greenhouse gas emissions during the pandemic, and I think we have to wait to have more reports about 2020 to assess the greenhouse gas emissions during the pandemic. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shadnoush. I'll take points of clarification for Shadnoush first, and then we'll go to some more detailed questions. So if anybody has a question that's a point of clarification for Shadnoush particularly, that would be great. Anybody? Anybody on the panel want to ask anything? You're welcome as well. Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Shadnoosh, why is Montreal so bad in terms of per capita despite all our electricity? So is it old infrastructure or what is it?
Actually, in some parts of Montreal it doesn't have a lot of energy efficiency programs. The first step of energy efficiency programs is taken by Hydro-Quebec and Energy, and is still at the beginning, and we have to improve energy efficiency programs. That's why we can see that the greenhouse gas emissions per capita is so high for Montreal, but because we still are, we have some households, they are still using oil for heating, and it's awful for greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question in the Q&A as well, which is quite specific. In slide 10, the references of emission factors are from other countries. Did you choose these countries on purpose, as we have Canadian emissions factors?
Actually, for my assessment, Rebecca, actually, I tried to figure out the emission factors only for Quebec. And there are some reports that we have specific emission factors for Quebec. But during my work, yes, I try to provide some emission factors because we usually, for the assessment of greenhouse gas emissions, we need emission factors, and we can. I try to make it faster and easier for other estimator to figure out the specific emission factor which is related to their area that they are doing the assessment. But when I wanted to provide these emission factors, I reviewed a lot of papers and sorry, a lot of reports that and I just figure out any emission factors that I thought it could be helpful for other estimators. I just put it in the tables and with the sources and with the locations and units.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, which is, so I understand correctly that Montreal has a very large potential for energy reduction that could be achieved quite easily.
Yes,
so optimistic.
sure. Yes, it's obviously, yeah. Definitely, even for energy efficiency programs that I know Ville de Montreal also is started already. So yeah, we have a lot of potential to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from energy consumption.
Yep, I think of the windows and how badly insulated so many of our windows are in old houses. When Europeans come here, they say, "Oh my gosh, what's with your windows and why are you so behind?"
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that we don't.
The most important roles for, I mean, this is the most important features for energy efficiency programs that they can be applied for buildings.
Yeah, I've always wondered whether the fact that we have hydro and so it's so cheap here means that people use more, whether that balances out.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to take a question from Emma Duplan now, which she said was a little bit more general. Emma, you can go ahead.
I'm still muted.
Oh, there you go.
Is that better? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question's about the balance between carrots and sticks. So far we've been talking quite a lot about using carrots, like rewarding positive behaviors, but I'm wondering about when we need to start using sticks or making people actually pay the full cost of their emissions associated with their behaviors. And particularly in the cost of the pandemic, if people are making decisions now about where to live, how to travel, maybe now is when we have to give them that more fair kind of estimation of what the costs of these different options are, so that we can maybe push them into the direction of making the wiser decisions.
Can I start?
Yes.
Yes. Let me start by saying that my short slide on policy recommendations are, is much more extensive than this short list. And indeed, I realize now that the ones I ended up putting on the slide are much more carrots. Although I would say that this has to do mainly with the second one I had for transport, which was to do whatever is necessary to keep demand down. And I think there's been a conversation ongoing for years now that this needs to come from sticks and not carrots. Carrots have not been working. We know that extremely well. And of course, there's the whole drive to increase zero emission vehicles and subsidize the purchase of electric cars. And now with a longer term target or medium to longer term target for stopping the sale of gasoline vehicles. But that was perhaps the main criticism for the transport aspect of the plan that was announced by the current government a few weeks ago. That in the end, it's the same approach as before. You put the end point, which is far into the future, and you don't do anything constraining to reach it. And I would venture to say that we know it doesn't work, at least not in the transport sector. It's too difficult or it's too substantial. So carrots are important, nevertheless, but certainly there needs to be perhaps a much more constraining approach to some of these choices, as Emma points out. I think that you're absolutely right, especially if the size of my arrows, as I put in the presentation, for some of these trends are much bigger than we perhaps initially thought in this transition. So is this a lot of people deciding to move away from city centers and employers not following? So I would perhaps put a caveat to the whole drive for sticks approach. We tend to lay that responsibility only on individuals, as people moving and deciding the location of their residences. But there's a lot of that comes from urban design decisions or lack of rules completely. There's a lot of that results from the organization or the geography of employment and employers' decisions to decide on different locations. And so that has to be part of a sticks approach as well. And that's a much more difficult discussion to be had. Not that the other one is easy, but still, I think indeed that is a discussion that needs to take place very rapidly in this context. For it, at least for the worry that this trend of urban sprawl accelerating, may be much larger than we even predicted will be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any follow-up questions for that on that issue? Shadnoosh, do you want to add anything?
No, actually, because I think Simon's went very well. Yeah.
Covered it. Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering, yesterday the City of Montreal released their climate plan, and I haven't had a chance to look at it in detail, but one of the things that I saw is that, unless I'm wrong, that they are planning on banning all but electric vehicles in downtown Montreal by 2030. Just a question for both of you. Do you think that's going to make a difference? Is that a significant action, or is it, more greenwashing, less impact type of policy?
I think
So,
Shadnoosh can, go ahead.
Yeah. So yes, definitely it works, because as I mentioned in my sensitivity analysis, we had the emission factor for light vehicles and heavy vehicles are the most significant factors that they have most impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So definitely, yes, when we try to use more electric cars, means we are trying to have less emission factors. So definitely it will work for have mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah.
I would add perhaps something that you mentioned, Shadnoosh, earlier, but in your chart at the end, you had 52% of emissions coming from transport, right?
Yes, in Montreal.
Yeah. So for all the city's potential in energy efficiency, that just increases potentially the the share that comes from transport. So I think
Yes,
these measures are,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, now I'm working on another, this is a journal paper about the greenhouse gas emissions from transport. And because I had a number of vehicles registered in Montreal, and I just want to figure out which type of vehicles, I mean, sedan or SUV, which one are exactly trying to produce more greenhouse gas emissions. And at the end, we believe that SUV are one of the most type of vehicles that they are producing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see a lot of SUVs in Montreal. And when we try to remove those types of vehicles from transport cycle, definitely we do have less emission factors and less greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you so much. I had another question, which was, were GHG emissions from road construction in your model, in your calculation, Shadnoush?
Yes.
Seems to me they're high in Montreal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The second one is natural gas with 26%. That it's still high, as I mentioned, because you know, there are some energy efficiency programs. I could say energy efficiency programs should be improved in Montreal. Yeah.
Okay, have another question from our Facebook feed. Just wondering, what's the overall result in numbers? Do decreases outweigh increases? We already addressed that one.
I think
Nope,
so. Although if
we've
I can
addressed
just
that
go
one as
back on
well.
that one, because I realized after that there was a question about, you know, the media pointing to reductions versus, you know, perhaps reality. I think it's pretty clear, even in the media for the past few months now, that whatever reductions were observed in April and May we were already pretty much back on track by the end of the summer and earlier elsewhere in the world, especially in large emitting countries like China and other bigger ones. But the situation is not different in Canada. So far, you know, it's come back to basically the same, at least order of magnitude, maybe not exactly the same trend and increase, but so that's also perhaps a more worrying starting point for what I discussed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, if we looked at initially the global greenhouse gas emissions, there was a little blip, right? 7% decrease or something,
Yep.
Which we thought, if that's total shutdown across the globe, that's the best we can do. It's not enough to meet our Paris Agreement obligations, is it?
That is absolutely that's a great point, and Canada is nothing different than elsewhere in the world on that regard, at least not from whatever preliminary numbers we can look at. There's a lot more work being done now with satellite imaging on evaluating real-time greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe that's one thing that comes out of you know, the financing that's been doubled and tripled and more than that for those research efforts. So hopefully we'll get because most of the data normally is at least 3 years back, and so you know, we've illustrated the limitations of that certainly in the current context. But yeah, so if everything shutting down leads to 5 to 8% reduction, that's certainly something to point out and to discuss perhaps in whatever effort we make.
Yeah, but I'm not pretty sure that with more medical waste and so on, we're gonna have still the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or not. Because as you mentioned, yes, we do have some less transportation for light vehicles, or even energy consumption, less energy consumption for commercial part, but we do have the increase for residential part, because we all now working from home, and we just switched to another sector.
Yeah, to be clear, that's what I meant, right? So the dip that that Rebecca was pointing out, the 5 to 8%, that it was already a small one, so that's surprising, but that's definitely telling us that not much you know, goes down even when you shut down what we thought was everything, but apparently not. So yeah,
exactly.
yeah, I agree with you.
I just try to because when I got the information for natural gas consumption from Energy, I just, for the webinar, I just reach out them again and ask them for any energy information that they have for during the 2020. I just wanted to compare because I had the results of 2016 and 2019. I could compare with 2020, but when I just compare, I figure out, yes, we do have less greenhouse gas emissions in commercial from natural gas consumption, but we do have more greenhouse gas emissions in residential part. So I think it's going to be the same.
Right. Does anybody else have any questions? Q&A? You let me know. Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
A question for Simon. You talked about some industries or some workers working from home even after the pandemic. So as a university professor, I mean, we have learned now, and students have learned that it's some people don't mind learning from home. Do you see that as an option where maybe we still teach live, but we record them and half our students don't even come in on a daily basis? What are your thoughts about the future of universities?
That's a great question. Certainly beyond the scope of you know, my presentation, I think, or even my reflection. But yes, that's an interesting question, Mark. I don't see you know, universities going back to exactly what was before, or whatever, you know, before was, obviously. So just like the work from home more generally in offices and institutional settings, the forced experience is going to do a lot in showing to people that have been wondering about this for 5, 10, 15 years now, you know, what it looks like. And it's also shown them, however, the downside of that. And I'll speak from my own experience for teaching this fall and in the summer as well. But I don't think people like it that much. At least that's not what I hear. So some people surely like it. But I'm assuming that these people were not necessarily coming in person to my classes before as well. So now they have access to the recording, you know, good for them. But that's a good question, obviously. I think there's going to be some form of hybrid, obviously, you know, medium term and longer term. And so a lot of universities are going to rethink that. If we think about this from a more competitive sector perspective, maybe some universities are going to play on that to you know, increase their share of students. That's also a pretty good possibility.
Okay, I agree with you. I have another question in the chat. A reduction in greenhouse gas emissions doesn't seem to be part of the business model of a lot of companies. Seems to me we should find ways to include it in their business models. Is this possible, and how so?
Shadnoosh, you want to?
Yeah, actually, now I'm working in industry, and we are trying to more work on energy efficiency programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, yeah, it's not a business model, but I think there are a lot of companies in industry that they are working on, and I think they are trying to improve the assessment of urban greenhouse gas emissions as the first step of mitigation planning, because to know which factors are producing more greenhouse gas emissions, first we need to know the contributing factors, which one is producing more and which needs in assessment of greenhouse gas emissions. And yes, I know that some companies, they are working on the business model, and yeah.
Yeah, I would add that you know, so far the experience has been that companies that have been for some time now large energy consumers, and the industrial sectors really, or the heavy industry sector at least, already went, you know, far into energy efficiency in the 1990s, well before we were even having these webinars on the topic, and that's because energy was so much of a cost, obviously, for them, that reducing their use was just, you know, an approach that made sense even without proper considerations to sustainability objectives. So now things are different, obviously, in this conversation. And for other sectors, it's a bit more tedious, although I would say that, you know, for the past 5-10 years, the movement has been encouraging. But yeah, it goes back to the question before about the sticks approach, right? What's necessary to incorporate that forcefully into the business models? Then, you know, you have to think about things like carbon pricing or emission quotas and so on, and a lot of other more refined policies adapted to, you know, key subsectors, for instance. But yeah. But efforts like Shadnoosh is doing to try to, you know, map out the specificities of the emissions are extremely helpful there, at least from the policy perspective, because you can say, well, I'll start with this one because I know it doesn't cost a lot and it's going to have, you know, that much reduction. And then you move into the tougher ones, of course, over time. And that's one of the main worries, obviously, with the longer term, the net zero stuff for 2050s and, you know, that kind of objective, which is that, you know, so far we're still into the easy part and we struggle with the easy part. So over, you know, 5, 10, 15 years from now, if we do reduce our emissions by 20, 30%, then we get into the tough stuff, which is reorganizing cities and changing industrial processes and whatever else. So definitely something to you know, keep in mind.
Yeah, even city planning, it can be really useful for greenhouse gas and for mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions.
Hey, I think we have one of our guests who would like to ask a question live. Risa, you can go ahead. I think you're
Yes.
unmuted.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is Reza here. I have a question. When you're saying that there will be an increase in the residential GHGs, is it basically a scientific-based calculation considering all the factors like the heating degree days, cooling degree days, occupancies, hours of operations, and those kind of stuff? Or is it only simply the absolute increase in the GHGs?
So for my side, actually, when I said about the greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas, because I got the information from the company, is charge of natural gas distribution over Quebec. So I got the information from them and I try to compare the natural gas consumption, because we had, based on their information, we had different sectors like residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial. So when I compared just only the data and I compared the results of this assessment for 2020 with my results from 2016 and 2019, I can figure out, yes, we do have a reduction in commercial, but in residential, definitely we have increase. Yeah, this is I think this is the scientific, because I have developed the model and this assessment is based on the model that I have developed.
Great.
Yep. Maybe I can add just a small thing, but obviously this is a very detailed answer. But yeah, energy consumption and emissions by extension in the residential sector in the buildings comes from space heating, 60%, then water heating, 25, and then the rest is lighting, electronics, appliances, and so on, which has been, you know, growing in importance certainly for the past 10 to 20 years. But still a relatively small part of the pie, right? So if you have people at home more, the equation is extremely simple. It's impossible that emissions don't go up by at least a small margin, and likely in colder climates or places with you know, hot summers and cold winters, you get an increase because the main points of consumption are necessarily higher. At best, they are the same, and that would be very tough to get. At least I'll speak for my own home, but for many people, I'm sure you know, realize this as well. And this is going to show up on their energy bill in the winter as well. I'm sure, as they'll figure out. Again, I wanted to highlight what I said earlier in my presentation, not to inflate this aspect too much, because this is not, you know, 25 million Canadians that are now seeing this shift, but it's still a sizable amount of people, and at least for the coming year, that's still going to be the case.
Great, thank you so much. We're just about out of time, so I'd like to thank both of our speakers, the Fourth Space for hosting us today, and all of you for coming. Jim, for your support, of course. Really great conversation that I feel like we could continue. So we will be posting the recording on the website of the Loyola Sustainability Research Centre, and it will be posted on the Fourth Space site as well, and we'll likely put that up. So you can come back to it. And if you'd like to reach our speakers, you can look them up on the Concordia websites. This is, as Anna mentioned, the last in our series for this year on sustainability and the pandemic. We do, the Loyola Sustainability Research Centre and the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability do run a seminar series that runs on the second Friday of every month during this time slot. We likely will not be running anything in January because we all need to catch our breath a little bit. So our next big event is our conference in March, which is the Sustainability Across Disciplines Conference. You can keep an eye on our website, which I put in the link for information about that. It will be a week-long online conference this year from March 15th to 19th. So open to the public, free, and great conversations just like this one. So we'd love to see you there. And with that, I guess I will hand it over to Anna, and with a final huge thank you to our two panelists today.
Indeed. Thanks so much. And for once, I'll keep it really short because you said it all, Rebecca. So just thank you for bringing this series to us at ForSpace. It's been a pleasure to host you this semester. And it's been really wonderful to hear Shadnoush and Simon share their insights today. Great to have you here with us. Jim and Rebecca, pleasure as always. We wish you a very nice weekend and we look forward to seeing you in 2021. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend.